Unit 4, Introduction to Materials Assignment, Part 1. Completing the Materials Assignment Template. For the materials assignment, you'll need to adapt or create materials to use during teaching practice. So your first discussion question is, why do we adapt materials? Pause the video and discuss this with your group or partner now. We adapt materials for a number of reasons. To suit our learner's age or gender. We may need to adapt the task's complexity, so a higher or lower level in grammar, lexis, phonology, reading, writing, speaking, or listening skills. We might want to better suit the type of learner, audio, visual, kinesthetic, analytical. It might need more graphic appeal, color, layout, images. We might want to consider our learner's culture or cultures, or specific group interests. So, in a nutshell, the factors we might want to consider when thinking about materials are our learner's needs, level, interests, and cultural setting. The key point to take away from this is that materials are produced to meet the specific needs of your learners. An adaptation with this end in mind will produce an appropriate lesson, good materials, and a good assignment. With the exception of the cover page of the MA, which contains a brief summary of the class data, you are expected to write between 400 to 500 words for the assignment, excluding the rubric word count of 143 words. What you write will be in response to the questions in the written MA, which we will look at in detail later in this input. The first draft will be read by one of our tutors, who will make very guided comments on your assignment and suggestions for improvements. The second version will be the final version you submit. This is the only assignment on the course that you will need to submit as a hard copy. On the final day of the course, a Trinity College London moderator will be there to first conduct a group interview, followed by individual materials assignment interviews with each of you, with each one lasting 10 minutes. There will be an input on how to prepare for the materials assignment interview in week 9, and during the face-to-face in February, you will also have practice interviews with your peers and tutors. There will also be opportunities to practice again with your tutor, either in the April face-to-face component or over WeChat, but you can also practice with your peers at any point. While all the other units on the course are internally assessed, it is the moderator who reads and marks your final MA. They take 5 minutes to read it, which is why it has to be no more than 500 words, and then they conduct the 10-minute individual interview with each trainee afterwards. Both the written and verbal parts of the MA are assessed by the moderator. You can read the assessment criteria in detail in your course handbook. So when it comes to selecting materials and the actual submission of your assignment, you want to choose one piece of material linked to a single task used in teaching practice. The use of published materials, and these might be either in print or online, is not excluded, but you need to have shown evidence of imaginative and significant adaptation and exploitation of these. This is not just for the purposes of avoiding plagiarism, but the assignment requires you to consider your particular group of learners when choosing the materials, and this is not evident when a task is simply lifted straight out of a book or off a website. You want to select a piece of material that worked quite well for your materials assignment. Even though we are huge supporters of learning from mistakes, with regards to this assignment, it's better to come from a positive place of learning than a standpoint of what you should have done better. At any rate, you are required in the written assignment and interview to discuss what could have been improved about the materials themselves. So the rest should be about what you have learned from this assignment, about how to create or adapt materials which were effective. You want to avoid materials from the engagement stage. For example, the pictures or aids you used at the beginning of the lesson to engage your learners and activate schemata. There simply isn't enough to evaluate about them, as materials used here are not for the purpose of practicing the target language, skill, or to meet your lesson objective. Consider using board games, information gap activities, or other materials that lend themselves to genuine communication and interaction, which create very strong materials assignments. All materials need an accompanying task, in other words, words on paper. You cannot use pictures or text only. If there is no on-paper task, if you gave the instruction verbally during the lesson, then submit written instructions with the MA materials so the moderator knows exactly what the students were required to do with the materials. Submit your original materials the way they were presented to the class. So if you created cards, present the cut-up cards, not the A4 template on which the cards were printed. Together with your materials, submit 2 identical copies of the completed assignment template. You'll see from the MA template, the rubric word count is 143 words. So when you do a word count of what you wrote for the rationale and evaluation, subtract 143, and what is remaining needs to be between 400 and 500 words. Trainees often have difficulty with getting the word count down to 500 or below. The trick here is to answer the questions as concisely as you can, while still including all the relevant information. The word count does not include the brief summary of class data on the first page, nor any wording on the materials themselves. It is possible to get full marks for the materials assignment. In order to do so, remember the following. There are 2 questions for each rubric. Make sure you answer both to get as many marks as possible. You can get a maximum number of 12 marks for the written assignment and a maximum of 12 for the MA interview. Organize your answers clearly in each box so it is obvious to the moderator and yourself that both have been addressed. You can use subheadings, separate paragraphs, or bullet points. Look at the criteria in your handbook for more detail on what the moderator will be looking for. You can also look at the 2 MA samples on Edmodo for ideas. If you can, have a look at the MA assignment template in your personal folder on Edmodo now. You can see that you need to complete the first page, which contains the brief summary of class data. And then you need to answer questions on both rationale and evaluation of the materials you submitted. So the first page, the brief class data summary, this provides the moderator with context and background on the learners for which you created or adapted and used the materials. What you write here is not included in the overall word count. You'll need to include the following details. The number of learners, not how many were actually there, but how many you planned for. What was the level? Was the class monolingual or multilingual? What type of material was it? Was it a board game? Was it a set of flashcards? What type of activity? What did they do? And at what point in the lesson were the materials used? How did it fit into the lesson? What came before it? What followed it? The rationale section of the MA is an explanation of why the material was developed for a particular group of learners and why it would be useful in achieving your lesson objectives. Why did you choose a board game to practice a particular tense, for example. You'll be asked what areas of language development you expected to work on with the learners with this material. So, which skills were they practicing? Did you create or adapt a text for a reading lesson, for example? Or what was the language focus? Was it grammatical or lexical? You'll be required to anticipate what achievements you're hoping for your learners, and any difficulties they might encounter, as well as strategies for dealing with these. Things to bear in mind are the learner's existing command of necessary structures or lexis to use the materials, pronunciation, class organization, such as what pairings or groupings to use, group dynamics, motivation, etc. We'll look at each question in detail in a bit. For the evaluation section of the MA, you'll be asked to explain how the materials were used in the classroom effectively, why they worked well or not, and how they can be improved for the same learners without changing the learning objectives. Again, we'll look at each question in detail in a little while. So the first question of the rationale is made up of the following two questions. What was the linguistic purpose of this material? So, what did you actually want to achieve with the learners with this material? And what were the objectives for the learners' language development? Specifically, what did you want the learners to be able to do when using the materials? These will be worded the same way that you would write objectives in your lesson plan. So, for example, by the end of the lesson, the learners will be better able to ... Rationale question 2. How did you think this material was appropriate to your students' specific linguistic needs? So, what kind of linguistic needs do your learners have? Is that the reason you chose to focus on that particular language point? Why was it appropriate? Why did you feel that the materials might be useful in addressing these specific needs? And for rationale question 3, after you had prepared the material and before the lesson, what difficulties did you anticipate for your learners? What solutions did you identify for dealing with those difficulties? You'll be asked to identify at least 2 potential difficulties and match their solutions clearly. Look at the samples for reference. And then we get to the evaluation. Question 1. Explain how you used the materials in the classroom effectively. What groupings did you use and why? So, think about what the interaction pattern you used was and why you used it. What did you consider when you grouped the students? Were you thinking putting a strong and weak student together, or an extrovert and an introvert together? How did the materials fit within the wider context of the lesson? So you'll discuss the stages of the lesson. What came before the activity where you used the materials? What came after? How well did this work? Evaluation question 2 asks you to think of reasons why your materials were successful or not. Was the pitching of level appropriate or inappropriate? Was there sufficient scaffolding? And how did you reach this conclusion? How do you know if the materials were effective or not? What did you hear and observe the learners do in relation to your objectives? Were they motivated? Evaluation question 3. How might the materials be improved for the same learners without changing the learning objectives in terms of targeting the linguistic need, and also in terms of design and presentation? Make sure you cover both these areas for 2 marks. So, how do we go about preparing for the materials assignment? Well, You can't start making materials quite yet because you're not sure of the types of lessons you'll be teaching during the face-to-face component. But what you can do is you can go through the MA task sheet with your group or partner, refer to the sample MAs on Edmodo, look at the MA assessment criteria in the course handbook, and start thinking about the kinds of materials you can create or adapt for your TP lessons in February. In this input, you've been introduced to the written part of the materials assignment and what you need in order to complete the template. We've also given you some sample assignments to look at and what you need to start considering with regard to materials in advance of your TP during the face-to-face component in February. In the next materials assignment input, we'll do a quick review of the written assignment, but then we'll also talk about what you can expect during the materials assignment interview that will be conducted on the final day of the course. So now, work with your group and partner to answer the key questions on the materials assignment in this week's task sheet. If possible, look at the MA samples provided with your group or partner. You can find these on the Resources and Samples folder on Edmodo. Discuss them with your group and note how the trainees have answered the questions. Organize your notes, highlight the key information about the materials assignment you've learned, and prepare any questions or comments that you may want to raise with your group or at the next OT. See you next Wednesday. Thanks for watching.